What I want to do very briefly in 5 minutes is just to give you a kind of snapshot of where we were around 1950. America at this time, the United States, was a country of about 152 million people. So it was slightly smaller than the America we know today. Virtually all of the country was centered population-wise in the East and in the West Coast, I'm sorry, and the Midwest. So that the big cities were New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, Detroit, and the like. Texas was still a relatively small growing society. California was the same. Florida was barely on the map in terms of population in 1950. So it was a very skewed kind of East Coast, Midwest population. After World War II, certain things begin to happen, meaning that GIs have come back, people who've been on the home front have been deprived of consumer goods, and people want to get back to sort of the regular way of living. So it is kind of, I wouldn't use the word orgy of consumption, but consumption becomes a very important part of the American psyche at this particular time. Marriage rates, for example, skyrocket at this particular time. And the marriage age for women goes under the age of 20 for the first time in almost in centuries. The divorce rate is almost non-existent at this time. 94% of the men in the United States between the ages of 18 and 30 in the late 40s and early 50s, 94% of the men get married and 97% of the women get married. And it's also, in some ways, a much healthier society. And by that I mean that you lived, your lifespan in 1900 was about 49 years. 49 years, which is really extraordinary in terms of how low it was. By 1950, it's already up to 68 years. So you've gained basically 20 years of life in the 20th century through antibiotics, through vaccines, but mainly through a decrease in infant mortality. Kids are really now, they are basically getting past the years where they used to be killed off in such large numbers by infectious disease. And therefore you have a society that's growing very quickly population-wise, marrying, having children at a larger rate. The third child in America is born at a much higher rate, and even the fourth child in America is born at an extraordinarily high rate. It goes up from about 2.6 kids per family in 1940 to 3.2 kids per family by 1950. So you see the population is going up dramatically. The suburbs catch fire. There had been virtually no home building during the Great Depression and World War II. And after World War II, you have the booming suburbia, which I'm sure you will teach, the growth of Levittowns and the like. Labor unions are at their height. Wages were high. There was a well-paid working class and a growing middle class. You're going to see in the 1950s, as Dr. Brands and others, I'm sure will tell you, you're going to have the growth of the national highway system. You're going to have the polio vaccine, the coming of DNA. You're going to have all of these remarkable discoveries that add to the length of life and the quality of life. At the same time, however, this is the bright side of the picture, and it is indeed very bright. There's another side of America at this time. One is that immigration restriction is so strong in America in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s through legislation passed after World War I, that the overwhelming majority of people living in the United States are native born. Immigration is almost virtually non-existent in this period. And that has changed so dramatically today. And we also have the African-American population, which at that time is about 15 million, about 10% of the American population, mostly living in the deeply segregated American South, where civil rights are virtually non-existent. And all of this will begin to change in the 1950s. But there are really two sides to the coin. And backing this system, this positive part of America and this negative part of America, is basically the growing Cold War. And what I want to do is to talk to you about that just a bit, that how we get to McCarthyism and Joe McCarthy. Now, you heard last night about the coming of the Cold War, but what I want to tell you from the perspective of people living in America, the Cold War was a depressing and anxiety-producing event. Why? We had come out of the Great Depression, we had come out of World War II, we had been victorious on two fronts, in the Pacific and in the Atlantic theater, and suddenly all of our momentum and our victory seems to be sort of taken away by the growth of this kind of communist empire that is expanding. We can talk about, and Dr. Lawrence talked about, why it expands, but from an American perspective, you fought the war, you've defeated Nazism, you have basically freed much of Europe, and suddenly, one by one, you are seeing countries fall to communism behind the Iron Curtain. And many of these countries have a fairly large population living in the United States, Polish Americans and the like. So there is a lot of political pressure as well. How is the United States going to respond? What are we going to do about it? You also have things occurring very, very quickly. China falls to the communists. The largest country in the world population-wise is suddenly now out of reach and part of what we consider to be really a demonic system trying to take over the world. China is now gone. The Russians get the atomic bomb in 1949. And that is really, in some ways, the most damaging from the perception of American power and psyche. The fact that no one expected the Russians to get this bomb this early, certainly not the American press, the FBI. American scientists did. The Soviet Union had dismantled its atomic facilities during World War II when the Nazis attacked. They were putting them together now. But 1949 appeared to be very, very early in terms of the Russians getting the bomb. And we had always seen them as kind of inferior, kind of ignorant farmers. How did they get the bomb? The answer is they must have stolen it. There must have been espionage. And I will talk a bit about that because I think it is quite important. So along with much of Europe falling to communism, China falling to communism, the Soviets getting the bomb, there are a series of really sensational espionage cases involving Alger Hiss, who had been a member of the State Department in the 1930s and 1940s. And clearly the evidence seems to show today, almost overwhelmingly, that he was a spy for the Soviet Union. You have Julius and Ethel Rosenberg and the Rosenberg spy ring, which certainly helped the Soviets get the atomic bomb earlier than they might have. I don't think there's a whole lot of discussion on that. Would the Russians have gotten the bomb themselves? Yes. Did the Rosenberg show them shortcuts to getting the bomb and deliver top secret classified information? The answer is also yes. And then on top of all of this, the momentum is the Korean War, which breaks out in 1950. And for the first time, the United States, through the United Nations, finds itself in a living, breathing, fighting war with communist troops, first North Koreans, and then the very large Chinese Communist Army. You add all of this up, Europe, China, the bomb for the Russians, espionage, Korea, and you really have Americans wondering what is going on. I want to give you just very briefly political background. The Democrats under FDR and then the surprising election of Harry Truman in 1948, the Democrats were just winning one presidential election after another. And certainly coming out of the Second World War and all of these shocks I've just told you about, the Republicans now had a very powerful issue. And that issue was that the Russians were winning, that the Soviets and the Chinese communists were winning the Cold War. And why was that happening? And all of this tends to come together under a senator from Wisconsin named Joe McCarthy. And McCarthy's mantra, what he begins to talk about and what Republicans begin to rally around, is the fact that the real enemy is not in Beijing, the real enemy is not even in Moscow, the real enemy is in Washington, D.C. In other words, there are people inside our government who want the communists to win, and they are selling us out and subverting us. And what McCarthyism really is a sense of, basically telling the American people there are X number of communists in the State Department. Al-Jahis was just one of many. The Rosenbergs gave the bomb away. And basically, you need, if all possible, what you really need is a government, and particularly sort of a politician like Joe McCarthy, who knows no rules, will take a club, will stand by the State Department, and basically take communists into the street, beat the hell out of them, get them out of government, and allow America to get back on the winning track. It's a very, very powerful message. And the question I think that you may want to talk to your students about when you talk about Joe McCarthy and McCarthyism is how basically honest is this message? In other words, is there some legitimacy to it, or is this all just a big smokescreen? And I think the answer is it's somewhat both. The Venona papers and other secret documents that have come out of US and Soviet archives find that there was a major spying operation by the Soviet Union at the Manhattan Project, in the State Department, the Treasury Department, and elsewhere. And the United States had been extremely lax during the Depression and World War II in its security methods. In that sense, McCarthy's message is somewhat accurate. The problem with McCarthyism, and Joe McCarthy in particular, is that he goes way beyond this. He begins talking about hundreds of communists in the State Department. He begins talking about communists in the US Army. He begins talking about communists in the CIA and all other governments, communists in the entertainment industry, in the teaching industry, and the lot. And there's very little evidence for this. I think the best way to sort of go about this is to fully acknowledge that the United States had a very devastating security issue during the Depression and World War II. But by the time McCarthy is making his charges in the early 1950s, the Federal Loyalty Security Program and other programs have sort of weeded this communist menace out. One of the ways you can say is, were members of the American Communist Party spying for the Soviet Union? Yes, they were. There is absolutely no doubt about it. They, in fact, were the major pipeline. But the other thing you have to understand in looking at the Rosenberg case and the Hiss case and other cases is that they virtually all took place during World War II and earlier. So by 1950, even though the Rosenbergs go on trial in 1950, and Hiss goes on trial in the late 1940s, there is very little evidence that there are still communists in the government. In other words, McCarthy is using old information. The spying that went on was real, it was vital, it was devastating, but it has largely gone away. And I think Venona and other and evidence from both Soviet archives and the United States archives attest to this. So you can't throw McCarthy and McCarthyism out with the baby out with the bathwater. By that I mean there was a problem. What you can say is that Joe McCarthy was reckless and irresponsible in keeping this campaign going. And he did it largely for political reasons. He was a Republican trying to smear the Democratic Party and Harry Truman for the subversion that appeared. But the problem is that when Dwight Eisenhower is elected president in 1952, McCarthy doesn't stop. And McCarthy is then attacking a Republican administration. And it really forces President Eisenhower to take a stand against McCarthy and McCarthyism, particularly when the Senator, Joe McCarthy, attacks the United States Army, which is Dwight Eisenhower's livelihood. So that it's sort of a tricky issue, and it goes both ways. How many communists were there in the State Department in 1952? Very, very few, if any. How many were there in the 1940s? There were quite a few, and they had been weeded out. But their trials were so spectacular, and they took part in the early 1950s, that it sort of gave a sense that this issue was essentially still being, that it was still going on. McCarthyism kind of ends in the mid-1950s. And it ends basically the result of its own excesses and the fact that moderate Republicans, led by Dwight Eisenhower, basically silenced McCarthy. And McCarthy hurt himself very, very badly during the televised Army McCarthy hearings, where he was blustery, he was insulting, and he had very, very little, if any, evidence to back up his charges of communism in the Army. McCarthy was then censured largely by Democrats and members of his own party, and kind of falls into disrepute and begins drinking very heavily. And as a very young man in his 40s, is dead within 3 years, and he dies of alcoholism. Does McCarthyism end with that? No. It still goes on, and is still used by politicians to tar the civil rights movement. It's used by politicians to tar President Truman when he wants to talk about one-payer, quote unquote, socialized medicine. I was looking just for this class to look at basically some polls regarding how Americans felt in the early 1950s about communism. And it's interesting. One public opinion poll asked, how great are dangers to are the communists in the United States? And it was like 97% in 1953, overwhelmingly the fact that communists are dangerous. Should communists be allowed to make a speech in your community? No. Overwhelmingly, people did not want that. Should a book written by a communist be in your local library? No. Overwhelmingly, public opinion polls showed Americans opposed to that. What about Joe McCarthy? The country was sort of split 50-50, but he begins to lose his arc in 1954 during the Army McCarthy hearings. And what you begin to see happen in these public opinion polls is that the numbers begin to change dramatically, and Americans on the whole are not nearly as concerned about issues of domestic subversion and McCarthyism. What they are interested in, and what they are frightened by, and what is enormously anxiety producing, are issues relating to the atomic bomb and the growing technological prowess of the Soviet Union. And I think that is something that I would like to talk to you about very, very briefly today. When it comes to issues of the atomic bomb, we are going to look at 3 pieces of film, 3 videos today. One of them is an issue about civil defense in America, particularly in New York City in the early 1950s. I was a child at that time. I remember it very well. We're going to talk about Eisenhower's really important speech involving the military-industrial complex. It's sort of his farewell address. And we're going to look at LBJ's Daisy ad as well, which is one of the more controversial ads ever put on television during a political campaign. Let me tell you very briefly my feeling about what I remember as a kid growing up in New York City during the quote unquote atomic era, when we really thought the chances of being bombed by the Soviets were significant. They weren't, because this was sort of pre-missiles, but we went through enormous civil defense drills. I'll talk about that in a little bit. What I think my clearest memory as a boy, I was about 9 years old, and in 1954, the Senate, in a resolution agreed to by the House and passed, put the words "under God" into the Pledge of Allegiance, the flag salute. Flag salute had been written in the 1890s during World War II. The Congress had agreed that it should be said at all public events in schools. And it did not have the word "under God," the words "under God" in it. But in 1954, as a way of differentiating the United States, and by that I mean that the United States had God on its side, that the Soviet Union was this godless place that had nothing to do with religion. Under God comes in. And I remember my fourth grade teacher, Mrs. McGurney, getting us around in a circle and telling us that under God had been put into the flag salute, and it was very important that God had chosen sides. He had chosen us in the Cold War, and this was going to be very, very important in our ultimate victory over the Russians. And I remember going home. My mother was a teacher. My father was a school principal. I remember saying as a 9-year-old, "Pop, I got something very important to tell you. God has chosen sides in the Cold War, and thankfully he's chosen us. And I just feel wonderful about this." And I remember my father giving me this very quizzical look, but also in no way going back to confront the teacher. This was just something that happened. It was done. And we now had under God in the flag salute and have it to this day. What I want to do with you when we're talking about now, so many of you are looking for ways to kind of teach the Cold War, to teach sort of the cultural parameters of the war that go beyond simple McCarthyism, that go beyond the issue of subversion in America and subversion in government. And what I'd like to do really is to talk about, I think, I know I'm kind of running low on time, 2 events very, very briefly that I think you can really bring before your students with a very positive result. One of them is Sputnik. As some of you know, I'm sure all of you know, you've read about it. Sputnik is this teeny little satellite weighing 180 pounds that the Russians launch in 1957. It causes an enormous furor in the United States. How did the Russians have the rocketry and the power to put this up into the atmosphere, going 18,000 miles an hour ahead of us? We'll talk about that when we get, I think, to the documents section. But it becomes a pivotal moment because it is now about American culture and American values. How did we let the Russians get ahead? How is it that we're so interested in the tail fins of our convertible automobiles? How that we are so interested in all of these consumer items, color televisions and the like, that are nice for our lifestyle, but that really do nothing to push us forward technologically, and certainly do nothing in the larger battle with the Soviet Union surrounding atomic weaponry and military technology. And one of the things I would ask you to have your students take a look at is in 1957, after Sputnik went up, Life magazine published an amazing 5-part issue called Crisis in Education, where for 5 issues in 5 weeks, they followed a Russian student named Alexei in Moscow through his school day, and an American student from Chicago named Stephen from his school day. Alexei is learning 3 or 4 languages. He is doing very complicated physics and chemistry problems. He is reading long novels. He plays several instruments. He's in great tip-top physical shape. You then go to Stephen in Chicago. Stephen has trouble with basic geometry, and he makes fun of his inability to do any better. He's taking courses like typing and claiming that he can do 1 word a minute. Most of his day seems to be taken up with his social life and his girlfriend, who is reading movie magazines stuffed inside her textbooks. And this is so stereotypical. The Russian students were not nearly as good as Alexei, and the American students were not nearly as bad as Stephen, but really the message is that we are looking at the wrong things, and we are doing so in the midst of a dangerous Cold War where technology and atomic weaponry is absolutely essential. Now, when we go to the document section, I'll talk about President Eisenhower and what he really knew about the balance of technological power and where we stood with the Russians vis-a-vis atomic weaponry. The other thing I would talk to you about in terms of showing clips and having your students read some is the famous kitchen debate in Moscow between Richard Nixon, who was then vice president, and Nikita Khrushchev, the premier of the Soviet Union. There had been a kind of thaw after McCarthyism. Stalin had died, the Korean War had ended. We didn't have détente. We still had a serious competition going on, a nuclear competition with the Russians. But in the late 1950s, both sides agreed that they would come together and show the best of each country to the other side. And what Richard Nixon does in Moscow is to show the centerpiece of the American exhibition, which is an American suburban home worth $14,000, which was about what Americans paid for a Levittown home or a suburban home in 1958. And it had a kitchen made by GE with all the latest appliances, dishwashers and the like. And the house was split in half so you could walk through it. Khrushchev comes into the house, and President Nixon is sort of extolling what he thinks are the high living standards of Americans. And Khrushchev looks at this and is completely disdainful. And he says to Nixon things like, Mr. Vice President, your country's been going on for a century and a half, and this is the best you can bring us. We have been going on as the Soviet Union for 40 years, and we have all of this extraordinary technology. And we will, within 5 or 10 years, also have the consumer goods that you think are so important to life. So it really becomes kind of a competition between Nixon and Khrushchev over the importance of capitalism versus communism. Which side basically is winning this cultural war? Nixon is very fast on his feet. He's talking about wanting peace. He's also talking about American military technology, but he is focusing on consumer goods. Khrushchev, on the other hand, is saying things like, well, do you have the kind of machine that puts food in your mouth and then stuffs it into your stomach? In other words, he's kind of making fun of what Americans have brought to Moscow, and also trying to show that there are more important things in life. Um, and, and that sort of kitchen debate crystallizes in many ways what Americans were putting forth in the 1950s as what they saw as important, which was, besides military technology, sort of the comfort and progress for American consumers. And on the other hand, you have Nikita Khrushchev, who was saying just the opposite. Oh, this is a bunch of junk. It's materialist crap. We'll have it all for Soviet citizens in 5 to 10 years, but that's not what we are about. That is really the message that comes forth at this particular point. The two sides are battling in an atomic world. They are battling over technology, but they also have kind of different objectives as well. And let me leave you with two thoughts before we go to questions. The first is that Richard Nixon gave an interview just before he died in 1994, and he was asked about the kitchen debate. And Nixon said, you know, when that debate occurred, I knew that the United States was going to survive. But I also believed that the Soviet Union was going to survive, and we would be having this kind of atomic and technological and consumer competition for generations to come. And that was my biggest surprise. Let me add a personal note before we quit. In the late 1990s, I chaired a panel at a military history conference. And the two major panelists were one, the son of Nikita Khrushchev, and the other, the son of Francis Gary Powers, the U-2 pilot who had been shot down in an extraordinarily controversial incident in 1960, working for the CIA. And what was really extraordinary about this was that Khrushchev's son had left the Soviet Union, was dressed to the nines like an American consumer, and we were eating ribs in Applebee's. Khrushchev's son on one side, Francis Gary Powers' son on the other side. And I realized very, very carefully at that particular moment that the Cold War clearly was over, that there had been no nuclear war, and that one of the two adversaries was gone, hopefully forever. Thank you very much. Let me stop here.